Sabina stood at the threshold of the room, her hands nervously clutching the edges of her apron, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. The air felt heavy, charged with an unspoken tension that made her skin prickle. Mr. Dawn's voice, calm and measured, beckoned her inside. She stepped forward, her eyes darting around the unfamiliar space. The room was vast, bathed in a soft, golden light that spilled from an ornate chandelier overhead. The floors gleamed with polished marble, and the walls were adorned with intricate patterns that seemed to shimmer faintly in the glow. But despite its beauty, there was something unsettling about the room. A faint, musky scent lingered in the air, mingling with the sharp tang of something wild, something untamed. Her gaze swept across the room, taking in the rows of glass cages that lined the walls. Inside, colorful pigeons fluttered their wings, their coos soft and rhythmic. Mr. Dawn stood in the center of the room, his hands tucked casually into his pockets, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her stomach churn. "I breed birds," he said, his voice smooth and deliberate, as if he were revealing a great secret. "Some of the finest in the city." Sabina nodded slowly, her throat dry, unsure of why he was sharing this with her. She had no interest in birds, no desire to know about his hobbies. But she remained silent, her eyes following him as he moved to a row of fish tanks. The water in the tanks bubbled gently, the sound soothing in contrast to the unease that gripped her. Golden fish swam lazily, their scales catching the light and scattering it in tiny, shimmering reflections. Mr. Dawn gestured toward them, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Beautiful, aren't they?" he murmured, more to himself than to her. Sabina nodded again, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her apron. She wanted to leave, to retreat to the safety of the kitchen or the small room she called her own. But she stayed rooted to the spot, her body tense, her mind racing. As Mr. Dawn continued to speak, his words began to blur together, fading into a distant hum. Sabina's attention was drawn to the far corner of the room, where a strange wooden contraption sat, its purpose unclear. The air around it seemed heavier, the scent stronger. She felt a shiver run down her spine, a premonition of something dark, something she couldn't quite name. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her chest tightening with each passing moment. She wanted to look away, to close her eyes and pretend she wasn't there. But she couldn't. She was trapped, caught in a web of fear and uncertainty, her body frozen in place as the room seemed to close in around her. Mr. Dawn's voice broke through her thoughts, sharp and commanding. "Pay attention," he said, his tone cutting through the haze of her fear. Sabina's eyes snapped back to him, her heart pounding louder now, each beat echoing in her ears. She forced herself to nod, to appear attentive, even as her mind screamed for escape. The room, with its gleaming surfaces and beautiful creatures, felt like a gilded cage, its beauty masking the horror that lurked beneath. And Sabina, standing in the center of it all, felt more trapped than ever. Sabina's fingers clenched the edge of her apron, her knuckles whitening as she tried to steady herself. The room, with its gleaming surfaces and the faint hum of the fish tanks, felt like a trap closing in around her. Mr. Dawn's voice cut through the air, smooth and deliberate, as he gestured toward the tanks. "These fish are imported," he said, his tone dripping with pride. "Very expensive." Sabina nodded mechanically, her mind racing. What did any of this have to do with her? She was a maid, not a caretaker of exotic pets. But before she could process his words, he moved toward a wooden crate in the corner of the room. Her breath hitched as he lifted the latch with slow, deliberate movements. A low, rumbling growl emanated from inside, and Sabina's body tensed. Four large dogs stepped out, their coats glossy and well-groomed, their eyes sharp and alert. They padded onto the tiled floor, sniffing the air, their tails swishing lazily. Sabina took a small step back, her heart pounding in her chest. Something about this felt wrong, terribly wrong. Mr. Dawn turned to her, a faint smile playing on his lips. "These are my best," he said, his voice brimming with pride. "Strong and well-bred." Sabina's breath came in shallow gasps, her hands cold and clammy despite the warmth of the room. She forced herself to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "What does this have to do with my job, sir?" He tilted his head, his expression patient, almost condescending. "You've been good, Sabina." You work hard. But now it's time for you to do more. Her stomach churned as he walked around the dogs, stroking one of their heads. From today, these dogs are your job. Sabina blinked, confusion and dread swirling inside her. I don't understand, sir. He sighed, as if explaining something simple to a child. You will feed them, clean them, take care of them. A small flicker of relief washed over her. That was all. She could do that. She nodded quickly, her voice trembling. Okay, sir. But then he added, his tone casual, almost offhand, and you will sleep with them. The words hit her like a blow to the chest. Sabina's stomach twisted violently, and she took a step back, shaking her head. No, sir. I can't. Mr. Dawn chuckled, a low, unsettling sound. Oh, you will, my dear. These animals have needs, just like humans. They have desires. Sabina's body stiffened, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The room seemed to shrink around her, the walls pressing in, the air thick and suffocating. The dogs stood there, calm and oblivious, their dark eyes watching her with a lazy curiosity. Her lips trembled as she pleaded, Sir, please. I came here to work as a maid, not for this. His expression darkened, the amusement fading from his face. His voice turned sharp, cutting through her like a knife. You think you have a choice? Sabina's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. She glanced at the door, but he stepped forward, blocking her path. No one leaves my house without my permission, he said, his voice cold and final. And if you refuse, you will regret it. Sabina's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic whirlwind. She forced herself to speak, her voice shaking. Okay, sir. I need time. Please, just give me 2 days. He studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowing, before finally nodding. Fine. 2 days. But after that, you do what I say. As soon as he left, shutting the door behind him, Sabina collapsed to the floor, her legs giving way beneath her. Her hands trembled, her mind spinning. She felt lost, trapped, and utterly alone. The dogs lay on their soft beds, their tails twitching in their sleep. One of them stretched, letting out a quiet sigh, while another lifted its head, staring at her with dark, lazy eyes before resting again. They didn't know. They didn't understand. But Sabina did. Her chest felt tight, as if the walls were closing in on her. She pulled her knees to her chest, resting her forehead against them, tears streaming down her face. What was she going to do? She had no way out. The door was locked, the windows too high, the house surrounded by tall gates guarded day and night. Even if she escaped, where would she go? She had come here for a better life, for her mother and her daughter, Amina. She had left home with dreams of sending money back, of building a future for her family. Not this. This was something else, something dark, something that twisted her stomach into knots and made her skin crawl. She thought of her mother, frail and sick, and her daughter, just 6 years old, full of energy and hope. She had promised to return with gifts, with happiness, with enough money to make their struggles disappear. But how could she go home now? What would she tell them? Would she even make it out alive? A sharp knock on the door jolted her from her thoughts. She held her breath, her body frozen, but no one entered. The knock was a reminder. 2 days. She had just 2 days to decide her fate. Sabina couldn't stop thinking about the time slipping through her fingers, each second bringing her closer to something she couldn't bear. She had no passport, no money, and no way to escape through the locked gates. Then, suddenly, an idea came to her. She faked illness, pressing her hand against her stomach and bending slightly as if in pain. When Mr. Dawn called her later that evening, she clutched her belly and whispered, "Sir, I'm not well. I have my period. It's very painful." "How long?" he asked, his voice impatient. 2 weeks, she answered quickly. "Sometimes it takes that long. I feel very weak." He didn't look convinced, but after a moment, he waved his hand dismissively. "Fine. Get well soon. But don't think this will change anything." Sabina lowered her head, murmuring, "Thank you, sir." That night, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. This was only a delay, not an escape. She needed something more. Over the next few days, she started paying close attention to everything. The guard's shift changes, the noises in the house, the routines of the family. She acted obedient, smiling when needed, working without complaint. Slowly, they stopped watching her so closely. Then one evening, while washing dishes, she turned to Madame, the lady of the house, and said softly, "Ma'am, the kitchen supplies are getting low." Madame barely looked at her. The next morning, when Mr. Don came into the kitchen, Sabina lowered her eyes and spoke carefully. "Sir, the food supplies are almost finished. I can go buy more." He raised an eyebrow. "You? Why not the driver?" Sabina wiped her hands on her apron, her heart pounding. "I know what we need, sir. I can go quickly and return." He looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to see into her mind, before reaching into his pocket and pulling out some money. "Fine. Don't take long." Sabina's fingers trembled as she took the money, bowing her head. "Thank you, sir." She turned and walked toward the door, her feet feeling like lead. Every step was heavy with fear, but she kept walking, out the door, through the courtyard, past the gate. And then she ran. Her heart pounded in her chest as she moved as fast as she could, not daring to look back. Her hands gripped the fabric of her dress, her breath sharp and fast. Finally, she saw a small building with men in uniform, the authorities. She stumbled inside, gasping for air, her hands shaking as she grabbed the counter. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "Help me." As soon as the words left her lips, Sabina fell to the ground, her body weak, her legs no longer able to hold her. Everything around her blurred, the voices, the footsteps, the bright lights above. Then there was nothing. When she woke up, she was lying on a small bench inside an office. A fan spun lazily above her, and the smell of old papers filled the air. A man in uniform stood nearby, watching her closely, while a woman officer knelt beside her, holding a glass of water. "Drink," the woman said softly, offering it to her. Sabina's hand trembled as she took the glass. The water was cool, sliding down her dry throat. She swallowed hard. "What happened to you?" the officer asked. Sabina opened her mouth, but no words came out at first. The memories crashed into her like waves, too heavy, too painful. Then, in a broken voice, she began to speak. She told them everything, the beatings, the insults, the hunger, the way they had treated her like she was nothing. She told them about Mr. Don, about the dogs, about what he had demanded from her. Her voice cracked, her hands clutching her dress as she spoke, but she didn't stop. She pleaded with them, "I don't want the money anymore. I don't want to work here. I just want to go home." The room was silent when she finished. The officers exchanged glances, and the woman reached out, squeezing Sabina's hand gently. "You are safe now," she said. For the first time in months, Sabina believed it. It took just a few days to arrange everything. The authorities helped her buy a plane ticket and returned her passport. They even handed her some money, 2 million Tanzanian shillings. It wasn't much, but to Sabina, it felt like a miracle. When she boarded the plane, she couldn't stop the tears that streamed down her face. This time, she wasn't crying out of fear. She was going home. The journey felt long, the hours dragging as she stared out the window, watching the clouds below. Her heart was restless. Would her mother be okay? Did Amina still remember her? Then, finally, the plane landed. The air in Tanzania was warm, carrying the familiar smell of earth and cooking fires. Sabina stepped out of the plane, her legs weak, her heart pounding. As she walked through the small airport, she scanned the crowd, her breath catching in her throat. And then she saw them, her mother, standing with her cane, her eyes filled with tears, and Amina, running toward her with her little arms stretched wide. "Mama!" Amina cried, crashing into Sabina's arms. Sabina dropped her bag and fell to her knees, holding her daughter tightly, pressing kisses onto her hair, breathing in the scent of home. Her mother knelt beside her, touching her face gently, as if making sure she was real. "You came back," she whispered. Sabina nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I came back, Mama." She looked at them, the people she had fought for, the reason she had survived. She was home. And she was alive. Sabina's story is not just hers. It belongs to thousands of women across the world, young girls who leave home with dreams of providing for their families, only to find themselves trapped in suffering. Many never return. Many are never heard from again. We must listen to their stories. We must speak for those who cannot. We must protect the women and girls still suffering in silence. If you know someone considering work abroad, tell them the truth. If you hear of abuse, report it. If you have a voice, use it. Because Sabina survived, but many others will not. Let's not forget them.